Welcome to the 2019 Iowa City Book Festival, presented by the Iowa City UNESCO City of Literature. We would like to thank the sponsors and partners who made this event possible. The City of Iowa City, the University of Iowa, the City of Colville, the Iowa City Public Library, Prairie Lights, Iowa Public Radio, the Graduate Hotel, Sustainable Iowa Land Trust, University of Iowa Center for Human Rights, Think Iowa City, and Go Guide magazine. Between events, be sure to visit the book fair at Merch, which is just down the street, that way, right next to the library on the Pat Mall. There, you can shop with artists, booksellers, publishers, and more. The majority of book festival events are offered without charge, but they are not free. Your financial support gives us the ability to offer programs like this festival. Please consider donating to the City of Literature by visiting iowacitybookfestival.org and clicking on Support. Today, we'll hear from author Kassandra Montag. Kassandra grew up in rural Nebraska and now lives in Omaha with her husband and 2 sons. She holds a master's degree in English literature, and her award-winning poetry and short fiction has appeared in journals and anthologies, including Midwestern Gothic, Nebraska Poetry, Perry Schooner, and Mystery Weekly magazine. After the Flood is her first novel. Please help me welcome Kassandra Montag. All right, she will take over.
Thank you. Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? Thank you all for being here. It's lovely to be here with you today. I'm going to start by reading a summary of After the Flood, and then I'm going to read you an excerpt from it. And after that, I think we're going to do a short Q&A to just discuss the book in a little bit more detail. So the summary of After the Flood is, after years of slowly overtaking the continent, rising floodwaters have obliterated America's coastal cities and its heartland, leaving nothing but mountaintop colonies surrounded by open water. Myra and her 7-year-old daughter Pearl fish from their boat, visiting dry land only to trade in the few remaining outposts of civilization. For 7 years, Myra has grieved the loss of her oldest daughter, Ro. But when Myra discovers that Ro was last seen in a far-off encampment, she and Pearl embark on a dangerous voyage into the icy northern seas. On their journey, Myra and Pearl join forces with a larger ship, but secrets, lust, and betrayals threaten their dream. Myra can no longer ignore the question of whether saving Ro is worth endangering Pearl and her fellow travelers. And that's really the sort of heart of the story. It's a story of a mother's love, and it's a story of survival in this very dangerous flooded world. And the passage that I'm going to read for you is after Myra has decided to go on this dangerous voyage to try to rescue her daughter. And as she's sailing, she's reflected on the world that she lost when the global floods really obliterated all of the cities and civilization that we know of. The closer we got to Harjo, the more we sailed over the old world, transitioning from the Pacific into water that now rippled over cities in California. I often sailed this way because I had to stick close to the new coast, but it always haunted me to sail over cities, over the mass graves they had become. So many people died not just during the floods, but during the migrations, from exposure and dehydration and starvation. Feet bloodied from trying to climb mountains and outrun the water. Possessions abandoned up the mountainside the way they were along the Oregon Trail. Some of the cities were so deep below, no one would see them again. Others, which had been built at higher elevations, could be explored with goggles and a strong stomach. Their skyscrapers rose out of the water like metal islands. I used to dive and spearfish in those underwater cities, but more recently, I'd done it only when I was desperate. I didn't like being in the water for long periods of time. Didn't really like being reminded of how it once was. Once, I was diving and swimming through an old city that had been nestled on a mountainside in the Rockies. Fish made homes in the wreckage, hiding amid the seagrass and anemone. I dove down into an office building that was missing a roof. A few desks and filing cabinets floated in the room, items around them nearly unrecognizable. Barnacle shells grew on a mug with a photo of a child's face, some birthday gift you once could get sent to you in the mail. I swam deeper. A school of angelfish scattered, and I speared one. As I turned to go up for air, the coiled rope I wore around my shoulder caught on the broken handle of a file cabinet. I yanked at it, jimmying the cabinet loose from the wall where it stood. Out of the shadows, a skull tumbled along the floor toward me, settling a foot away. I yanked on my rope again to get free, and the cabinet fell toward me. I shoved the cabinet to the side so it wouldn't fall on me. In the space behind where the cabinet had stood, two skeletons lay on their sides, facing each other as though in an embrace, like falling asleep with a lover. One skeleton didn't have a skull, but by the way it was positioned, turned toward the other body, I imagined its head had rested on the other's chest, positioned like they were waiting for their fate, and chose to hold each other when the end came. Disintegrated clothing fluttered around them. Rocks lay on the floor all around their bodies. My oxygen-deprived brain recoiled before I realized they must have filled their pockets and stuffed their clothes with rocks so they would succumb to the water as it slowly inched upward around them, covering their arms that touched the floor first, a final whisper between them, between it covered the arms that held each other. Otherwise, the water would have separated them when it came, pulling them apart, floating their bodies before it sank them. I dropped the sphere and swam for the surface. I traded for nets at the next post, and from then on, I only dove when the nets came up empty. I didn't know how to talk to Pearl about what lay beneath us. Farms that fed the nation, small houses built on quiet residential streets for the post-World War II baby boom, moments of history between walls, the whole story of how we move through time, marking the earth with our needs. It felt like cruelty to bury the earth, to take it all away. I'd look at Pearl and think of all she wouldn't know. Museums, fireworks on a summer night, bubble baths. These things were already almost gone by the time Ro was born. I hadn't realized how much I lived to give my child the things I valued, how my own enjoyment of them had grown dull with age. But other times, when everything was so dark out on the sea that I felt already erased, it seemed like a kindness that life before the floods had gone on for as long as it did, like a miracle without a name. And I chose to read that passage because it's a passage that's a bit of an elegy. You know, it's speaking about this great sense of loss when the floods overtook the earth. And, you know, to me, I think that so much of the book, there's this theme of hope, and you can't really, the character really discovers how much she needs hope because of everything she's lost. So I was supposed to be interviewed, but I don't think my interviewer is here. So I'll just start with discussing a little bit about what led me to write this story and what gave me the idea for it. So the premise really, you know, of this future flooded world and a mother and a daughter came about through three places. And one is that I had a dream, I had an image in my mind's eye, and I also had a line from a journal, and all of these things came together. So the dream was this. I had been living in the Netherlands, and I moved back to Nebraska. And when I moved back to Nebraska, I became pregnant with my first child. And I started to have these pregnancy nightmares. Essentially that I had brought the ocean with me from the Netherlands all the way into the United States, into Nebraska. I had this image of looking, you know, looking out my bedroom window and seeing this wave of water coming across the prairie, almost as if there was a tsunami in the middle of Nebraska. And I kept having this nightmare over and over again. And I knew that the nightmare was really a sort of transparent metaphor for my anxieties about becoming a mother, anxieties about how I was going to raise my child, how I was going to balance the disparate responsibilities I felt between being a mother and also being a person in the larger society. So I think all of those anxieties really came into that imagery of this, you know, massive flood in the middle of Nebraska. And so after I had that that dream, I started to have this image in my mind's eye of a mother on a small boat with her young daughter. And when I had this sort of image, I knew that she was a mother who was living to protect her young daughter, but that she was separated from a second daughter. And that within her, there were these sort of, these questions and this pull between, you know, I want my life to be about protecting my young daughter, but I can't abandon and just forget about my other daughter. Because what happens in the book is, at first, Myra doesn't know where her older daughter is, but then a random act of violence reveals to her that her older daughter is in danger and is being held captive. And the story very much becomes about that struggle of feeling torn between protecting that younger daughter and wanting to rescue her older one. And then the line from the journal that also came into play. I had a journal from about 10 years ago, and the line is, a small group of people huddle around a campfire searching for a safe haven. And that image to me, it feels very much like a Western image of people gathered around a campfire. It's a survival story. They're trying to survive. They're trying to work together. In that image also, I think there are ideas about community, the ways that community can protect us, but also the ways that we can be betrayed with our own communities. So there's a lot of inherent conflict in that. And this sort of, that dream of this global flood and that image of a mother began to sort of brush up against this line from my journal about the group of people and suggest sort of narrative possibilities. And I began to realize that this was going to be a story about a global flood caused by climate change and a mother's love for her daughter, but it was also going to be a story about survival and community, and how do we work together to try to rebuild society after we've lost everything that we used to depend on. What are the ways in which violence comes into play when there's a power vacuum? What are the ways, though, that we can also strive for redemption and look for ways to rebuild not only the world, but ourselves? And so those were all the sort of images that I was working with, and the larger questions that really came into play for the book. I have a quote I want to share with you. It took me about 2 years to write the book, and I wrote it in the midst of having my 2 kids, and so it was a very busy time for me, and I just felt like it was a story that I really wanted to share, and I gave it to my husband. He's always my first reader, so when I had a draft of it, I gave it to him, and he said it made him think of a quote by Ralph Ellison from The Invisible Man, which is, "Life is to be lived, not controlled, and humanity is won by continuing to play in the face of certain defeat." And I love that quote, and the fact that my husband brought that quote up, that it made him think of the book, because that is something that I was striving for. There is, darkness in the book. There are moments of despair, but there's also this, sense of optimism and hope, this sense of trying to continue to play in the face of certain defeat, trying to defy what we've lost by insisting that we're going to move on and continue our lives and hopefully change for the better. So those were, really just the ideas that went into the book, and I'm interested also if you all have any questions. I would love to, yeah.
All right, so I'm John with the Book Festival, and Kassandra had asked me to help her a little bit with Q&A. I wanted to jump in maybe to start with one. So the story is told almost exclusively after
Right.
the catastrophe happens, after the flood happens. Why did you decide to start there as opposed to maybe into the lead up there?
Right, yeah. No, that's a great question. I'm really interested in, and I kind of found this out through writing the book, but I'm really interested in what I think of as the trauma of after, that when we experience a traumatic event, it's obviously traumatic, but their trauma doesn't just disappear, it lingers, it has ongoing consequences, and that part of the real struggle with a traumatic event or a catastrophe, like after the flood, is that question of after. What do you do after? How, to me, it brought up all these questions of, can a person heal, or how much can a person heal? And also adaptation. I thought a lot about, in this book, about nature and the natural world and the animal kingdom, thinking about how animals adapt, and then also thinking about humanity. How much can humanity adapt, both personally as an individual? How much can you adapt when you've encountered something traumatic, but also society as well? So, yeah.
And what kind of research went into this? We obviously have not experienced something
Right.
like this.
Yeah, I had to do a lot of research. And first into ships and sailing. So I'm from Nebraska. I am not a sailor. I get seasick, and so I did a lot of research. First with books. I actually used children's picture encyclopedias to just look at like the cross section, like a bird's eye view of a ship, and learn about each and every part. I watched documentaries and YouTube channels of people fishing. But then I also, to build the world in a larger sense, I did a lot of historical research into like the Vikings and the sea peoples of ancient Egypt, people who really lived on the water and made their lives on the water, because I wanted a sort of I wanted it to have this like gritty realism of how are people finding fresh water, how are they preserving their food, all of these things. Because even though the book takes place in the future, it in some ways feels a little bit historical because, technology does not exist. A lot of the comforts we're used to don't exist. So it's kind of an interesting feeling there where I had to go back to history and think about how did people survive before refrigerators and cell phones and everything like that.
Does anybody from the audience have any questions at all? All right, go back and get Tom here.
Thank you for coming over, by the way, today. Enjoyed it very much so far. This is kind of an off the wall, I suppose, but did you have any special thoughts or visions or thoughts, I guess, during the massive floods in southwest Iowa and Nebraska last spring?
Yeah.
I mean, what went through your mind during all of that?
Yeah, it was surprising. I mean, I think it was, interesting timing that all happened right before the book released for me. So I think it was, first, I guess my first reaction was sadness, that because there was a lot of destruction, especially I know in Nebraska, a lot of farmers and ranchers, they lost crops, livestock. So I felt grief for them. But I also felt like I saw some small parallels between what was happening in the world and some of the themes in the book, kind of going back to how I was talking about community in this sense of how do you rebuild after you've lost something. And I felt like when I was reading news stories about those floods and, throughout the Midwest, I did read about people who were reaching out to help other people who were really engaged in very generous acts. And I think that's something that always makes me optimistic about the future. Again, like I say, while this is a bleak picture of the future in some ways, there is optimism, and namely that optimism rests in times when people choose to be compassionate and choose to be generous. And I do feel like we've heard, some news stories. So while I'm saddened by, what people went through with those floods, I do think that there's just like a little glimmer of a silver lining.
Any other questions from folks in the audience? Sure.
So with this book, we get a lot of other characters besides Myra. Who was your favorite one to write about?
Yeah. So I love Pearl. Pearl's my absolute favorite. So she's the 7-year-old daughter of Myra, and she's a little bit of a snake tamer. She plays with snakes, and she also ultimately uses a snake as a weapon. And so she is someone who just is she's very wild. She's kind of close to a feral child in some ways. And so she was a lot of fun to write. And I love Pearl's her ability to just be part of nature, I think. It felt very real to me. And writing her also came very naturally. When my mom read the manuscript before it was published, she teased me about Pearl a little bit because she's like, you basically wrote yourself as Pearl. So maybe that's why it came naturally. But I like how she's a little bit sassy, too. So.
We got a question over here.
I was just kind of curious about, you also said the story was about like, mother's love and all that, and in a story that's also like about a bunch of floods. So I'm kind of curious as to how you juggle the two components of the story. If it's better, if you find it's easier to put it one in the forefront while the other one's going on, or like how you best do that as you're drafting and writing.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think. But for me, they were so intertwined, the premise, the flood and motherhood, that I didn't have to think about them as disconnected per se. I guess maybe the one way in which I had to try to balance them was some of the scenes about the flood or about them dealing with the flood are more action-packed, like more moments of danger, whereas some of the motherhood scenes are a little bit quieter scenes. There may be scenes of reflection or closeness. So I had to sometimes think about going back and forth. And the scenes of the flood are also a little bit darker, I would say, again, because they're more dangerous. The scenes of motherhood where, maybe Myra is taking care of Pearl, they're a little bit softer. There's a little bit more light. And so, just when I revised the manuscript, I did go back to kind of see, okay, do we have a balance? Are we going back and forth and threading this so that the audience gets a break, from the danger scenes and then gets to kind of enjoy something that feels a little bit more heartwarming to give them a reprieve. Yeah.
So this book deals with the climate, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
It's maybe part of a new genre, climate fiction, perhaps. Right. When you were writing and starting to conceive the book, were you thinking of it in those terms, or maybe another genre? How do you see this book fitting into all of that? Yeah,
that's a great question. So I knew that it would probably be characterized as a type of the climate fiction, which is new right now. But the thing that I was actually really thinking about as far as genre goes is I thought of this really as a Western set at sea. And a lot of that's because Myra in the beginning is the lone survivor, and Westerns deal with the myth of the lone survivor. And Westerns normally deal with questions of the individual versus society. And Myra is such an isolationist in the beginning of the book that so much of her journey is kind of questioning, can she live in this isolated way? Does she need a community in order to survive? And so I felt like it was even playing with some of those sort of tropes and themes that you find in Western literature. And I think the other main genre influence that helped with this book was thinking about the epic saga, because this is a journey tale, and it also has kind of an old feeling about it in that way. It's a very long journey. And so I even spent some time going back and reading Icelandic sagas just to kind of get a feel for, the historical time period, but then also, how do you sort of maintain narrative momentum in a long journey? How do you do that narratively? Yeah.
Do we have any other questions? Sure.
Hi.
Hi.
Well, I happen to know that you're also a very talented poet. And so I wondered if you could talk at all about how your writing as poems worked in conjunction with this, in a contrast, or how it fed the novel.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wrote and published poetry for a decade before I wrote After the Flood, and so poetry does influence me so much because that's really where I felt like I got my writing chops as a writer. And one of the things is, so it helped in a lot of ways as far as descriptive, metaphorical language. It helped in trying to be like moments that require subtlety, because poetry tends to have this sort of subtlety, as Dickinson tells us, tell it slant, don't state it directly. But in other ways, I had to unlearn some of the things that poetry had taught me, and one of them is that poetry really deals with stillness. It deals normally with a moment in time. I remember my poetry mentor used to talk about poetry as being like a vertical moment, a moment that goes deeper and deeper. And in contrast, fiction is normally about narrative momentum and things moving forward. It's almost more of like a horizontal sense of movement. And so I really had to learn a lot about how to keep a story moving. And with that, I had to learn a lot about plot, really, because I didn't know anything about plot when I was writing poetry. So I think that was the biggest thing that I had to encounter with switching, two very different forms, going from, highly meditative, contemplative poetry to a fairly fast-paced commercial novel. Yeah.
I wanted to see if I could jump back. You were talking earlier about kind of the epic journey aspect of the book. There's a lot of geography here, though interestingly it's all underwater, but you're still dealing with what had been there. Mm-hmm. How much did you have to go into that process to figure out where things would be and what the topography would be like, and did you have to actually travel to deal with any of that?
Right, yeah, that's a great question. So I really spent tons of time on Google Maps, just hours and hours on Google Maps. And I spent a lot of time especially paying attention to the elevation of different countries and cities so that I made sure that what is above water and after the flood is consistent around the world, based on where I have the new sea level. And so, and I do remember, this was a little bit later in the process, but I interviewed an ecologist, and he showed me he had computer software that is able to sort of look at the topography of different countries and think about, like, okay, if the water level was here, then this would be in existence or this wouldn't. So that helped me a little bit. That was a little bit later in the process. So what really helped was Google Maps, and I would create these really long lists of, like, well, this country would be completely underwater. This country would have this city above water. And so I just would go through and just chart everything out. Yeah.
Do we have let me bring the microphone to you, sir, just a moment.
Along the same
Well, no, actually, we need to have it.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Along the same line of reasoning, do you have a science editor, or when you had somebody, you just had to do all this research yourself? And
Yes, I did it. Yeah, I did it all myself. I did have the interview with the ecologist, and I had an interview with an environmental historian, but I did do all of it myself. So it was kind of my own education into the subject. I was really passionate about the world. Really, when I have an idea, I'm normally very, very curious, and that curiosity drives me. So yeah, I did just do it myself.
And did I understand that you have two sons? Is that correct? Is it an active decision to choose that your main character had two daughters?
Interestingly, it was a subconscious decision, in that when I had that image of Myra, she was on a boat with her young daughter, and I decided to just go with that image, not change the gender. And I knew also that the daughter that she was separated from was a daughter, but also that in part of the reason that she's in danger is because of her fertility, because in this future world there are breeding ships, and so young women are in a little bit more danger than young men. So there was kind of a narrative choice there, but then also maybe just a subconscious sort of thing going on when I had that image, and I just decided to go with it.
My next question is going to be a little bit of a commercial for your next appearance at the festival, because Kassandra will be on a politics panel.
Oh, yeah.
And I know you'll probably delve into this a little bit more, but I was interested in reading the book that, as fraught as discussions about climate are politically, you steered completely clear of that, but you do deal with the political in terms of the interpersonal politics. I was wondering if you could talk about those decisions.
Yeah, that was kind of a tough decision, trying to figure out how much I was going to reference, the current political climate around climate change. And part of the reason I chose to steer clear from it is that I think that those sort of discussions can be very polarizing, and I really wanted to focus on the emotional realities of these characters. And I felt like by focusing on the emotional realities of the characters, we can maybe locate the things that we have in common, because politics is right now a place that's so rife with disagreements and not always cooperation. And so I felt like in writing a novel that's not just focusing on those disagreements, but focusing instead on what humanity has in common, maybe that could present like a different voice to the discussion. So I think that's part of the reason for that. But like you say, there is a sense of politics in the interpersonal relationships, in the sense of the characters do fight amongst themselves about what they want, and you do see how those conflicts sometimes push them forward in their decisions of how to deal with resources, but then sometimes hurt them, particularly when they're keeping secrets and not communicating in the most advantageous ways. So, yeah.
And given all of that, have you had any responses from readers or reviewers that maybe surprised you in terms of how they have seen the book against that larger context of what we're dealing with?
Yeah, I mean, nothing terribly unexpected, though I did get, I saw on Instagram someone reviewed the book and they mentioned, so in the book, there are these groups of people that I call raiders, and they're people who are essentially trying to rebuild society through violence. They're colonizing different places. They're using slavery. And it was interesting because the person who wrote this review on Instagram mentioned she called them cults. And I hadn't really thought of the word cults in regard to these groups of raiders, but it is, that is accurate though, because they're the raiders in the novel are very much driven by their particular ideology, and then their particular ideology of what kind of society we should have influences how they treat people. So I think it was just maybe not surprising per se, but a nice insight. Yeah.
Do we have any other questions from folks in the audience? Well, I can keep going. So I understand that this has been optioned for television.
Yeah.
So what has that process been like? What do we have to look forward to?
Okay, so it's in development right now, so fingers crossed that it'll stay in development. But the writer attached right now is Linda Wolverton, and she wrote Maleficent and Alice in Wonderland. What's interesting, she wrote the original Beauty and the Beast, and she apparently, the story is that when she was in the studio trying to write the character of Belle, and a lot of the studio executives told her, like, Belle needs to want to get married and bake a cake, and Linda really wanted Belle to be a reader. She wanted her to be a woman, who had ideas and who was independent, and she would bang her head on the desk in front of her, like, to try to, just like get through to people that she really wanted to create a different character. And when I was 4 years old, it was the first movie that I saw in the theater, and I was too little to keep the seat down because it kept folding up on me, and so I stood up during the entire movie because I was just obsessed with the character of Belle. And so it just feels like this almost like magical sort of thing that the creator of this character, who meant so much to me because she was an independent woman, she was a lover of books, those things that even at 4 I loved, and now she's heading up the adaptation of my first novel. So it's crazy.
So it sounds like Myra and Pearl are in good hands.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Are you involved in this process at all, or is it you just are keeping yourself at a remove?
Mostly at remove, because I very much trust Linda. I will be an executive producer and a consultant, so which essentially just means that they'll run things through me, to sort of check off on things or if I have any extra ideas. But they're the ones who are really creating the content. Yeah.
I don't want to monopolize our time. Does anyone out here have any questions? Okay. Any books in the works? All right, I will relay that. Any books in the works? Any next projects?
So I do have a new project. I'm not too far on it, so I can't say too much, but it's a different kind of book. It's more of a gothic murder mystery set in the Nebraska sandhills. So
you've shifted into prose from poetry. Are you still doing poetry?
I do, yeah. Not often. I normally do poetry if there's almost kind of like a poem. Sometimes I almost hear the first couple of lines of a poem, and if that happens, then I'll pursue it. But I'm really spending most of my time focusing on novels. Yeah.
So now that you are at this stage of your writing career, are there things that you know now that you wish you'd known then? Advice you'd give your younger self?
Yeah. Yeah, a couple pieces of advice. One is that, and I heard this on a podcast somewhere, I wish I could remember who said it, but they said, trust emergence. which is the sense of like trust that what you need for the story will emerge. And that's really been helpful to me. Sometimes if I've come up to a point, you know, in the novel that I'm working on where I don't know if I'm making the right choices, I don't know if this character makes sense, and it helps me to relax a little bit, to just trust that it'll emerge, like the right sort of characters will emerge, the right ideas for the plot. So that's been really helpful, that I wish I had done more of. I feel like, you know, as a younger writer, I would sometimes like almost like clam up or like get really tense and like think that I was going to like force the story into being. And I think just relaxing a little bit has helped. And I think the last bit of advice I would have given my younger self would be I'm trying to think again of who said this. I think it was Saul Bellow, but I could be wrong, to fail better. You know that sort of, there's like this quote of try again, fail again, fail better. And this sense of to just keep going, that it'll never be perfect, but that you have to keep going.
So along that line, is After the Flood the most recent of a series of projects? Do you have novels in the drawer and this is the one that finally clicked for you, or was this kind of the first foray?
So I have what I call half of a failed novel. That's a Western, like a true Western. I know I said this seems kind of like a Western set at sea, but the half of the failed novel, it just didn't seem to have enough story to really propel an entire novel. I think it would have been a really good long short story or novella, but I didn't feel like the bones were all there, if that makes sense. So I have that, yeah.
Got a question over here? Sure.
So, did you always know when you were writing poetry that eventually you wanted to write a novel, or did it just emerge with your being pregnant and the dreams you had and the visions and that sort of thing?
Yeah. So a little bit of both. I did always feel that I wanted to write novels. Like I was ultimately a long-form fiction writer, and I even had professors who would mention that to me. They would say, your poetry is lovely, I like your poetry, but I just have this sense that like you want to create a whole other world and populate this whole other world, which would of course require a larger scope, like a novel. And so I did always really want to write novels, but I was really scared to. I think I was really nervous about the investment of the time and the energy, because it is a huge investment, particularly like all the research that I had to do for After the Flood, because it's not just the writing it's creating a believable world and doing a lot of research. And so I always felt like writing novels is where I wanted to be, but I was scared to, and I do think that becoming pregnant was a different kind of impetus, because when my son was born, I, of course, love him and adore him, but I also had this sense of half of my life being over, or a certain part of my life being over, because I was ushering in to this new role as a mother. And that felt a little bit like a wake-up call of, time is passing. And when you have very young children, you see time passing because you see it, and how quickly they grow through clothes or shoes or whatever. It's very visible. So I think that also sort of assured me that that you want to write novels, you should start now.
Okay, question over here.
Hi. So speaking to your world building a little bit, how did you deal with issues like language, national identity, religion, like these ways of organizing humanity in the wake of like a tragedy in a new landscape?
Yeah, do you mean if I sort of had to, like if different languages and nations played a role in the different groups that were forming in the world? They did, yeah. So the way I envisioned it is, when these great floods were happening, people in their countries migrated essentially to the highest elevations. So that meant for a lot of people there was a lot of migration, but it was also fairly localized migration in some cases. So as a result, the novel starts in Nebraska and takes place pretty much over North America for most of the novel. So there still are a lot of English-speaking people. So that's how I was able to kind of deal with, because it would be very hard to read a novel if it is constantly going into different languages. So I had to kind of deal with that. There are a couple of places where on their journey they meet people of different nationalities who are speaking different languages. But largely the way I had envisioned it is that people in those countries would, migrate to wherever the highest elevation is and sort of form almost what's the beginning of another nation, but that in some ways was based off of the nation that they came from, since it's still going to be, fairly localized. And people are traveling, so they can, go to other nations or whatever because they do have boats, but it's quite dangerous in this world, and so people still stay fairly close to home base. Yeah.
If you would please help me thank Kassandra Montag for coming to the Bible City Book Festival.